Welcome to today's presentation, Best Practices for Migrating Your Chef Server. Let's go ahead and get started. Irving, why don't you kick us off by telling our audience a bit more about yourself and what we'll be covering here today.
Thanks, Jamie. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the webinar. All right, so I'm Irving. I'm Principal Customer Architect here at Chef, and I've been at Chef for over 4 years. Been working on some of the largest customer Chef Server installs that we have, and have learned a few things about those in that time.
And hi, everyone. I'm Josh Hudson. I'm the technical lead of our strategic customer engineering team. I've been with Chef for about 2.5 years working with Irving. And in that time, I've been helping all of our customers be successful with Chef, but specifically the last several months, I've been assisting with several large Chef Server migrations, which is why I'm here to talk to you about it today.
Awesome. All right, before we dive into the content, I'd like to just propose a little bit of a straw poll to you. So you don't have to incriminate yourself, but who here has a friend that has a Chef Server that might be in need of a little bit of tidying up? Say it's got continuous delivery pipelines that ship cookbooks to it, and there's lots of unused cookbook versions. You've got some cloud environments with nodes that come and go, but maybe they don't get cleaned up off the Chef Server. So there's a poll that you should see pop up, and answer. Give us your answer, and then we'll see how you all are. All right. Hopefully everyone's voted. Let's see the results. So no surprise here. Most people need a little bit of cleaning up. That's why you're here. So you're in the perfect webinar. Thanks for joining. All right. One more quick question. If you've never, and this is a negative question, if you've never exported your data from a Chef Server, and this isn't using the tools and the documentation like Knife Backup, but taking an export using an object-based export tool through Knife, let us know. And if you don't know what an object-based backup tool is, then just say you've never done it. All right, let's see the results. Oh, actually about even. So more than half of you have created an object-based export of your Chef Server in the past. That's awesome. Good on you. And if you haven't, you're in the right place. We're going to take you through that process today. Okay, so let's talk about migrating your Chef Server. The analogy that I like to use is it's moving day. And the process of moving your Chef Server or migrating your Chef Server is a lot like moving your house or your apartment. And I think you'll see why in a second. So the first thing that you want to do before a migration is you want to clean up. Just like you wouldn't move your house without first cleaning up a bit and making sure that you're only moving the essential things that you need. You're going to do the same for your Chef Server. And many of you might be here just for the cleaning up bit, and you might not be interested in the rest of it. So we'll show you what tools you need for cleaning up and what that process looks like. After that, you're going to pack up your stuff into boxes. Now, the reason that we all use moving boxes is because they make moving easier. You get everything into something that's the same size and shape, and that makes it easier to move things. We're going to do the same thing for your Chef Server, and we're going to export all of your Chef Server objects into JSON files that then are really easy to look at and move around. Third, we're going to deal with the things that don't neatly fit into those boxes. So there might be oversized objects or even objects that have somehow gotten corrupt over the years. And we've got some tools that show you how to clean those up before importing them into the new Chef Server. 4 is the ever important transportation step. So you've got to live while you're moving, and you might be moving a very large house across the country or across a long distance. And so somehow you've got to exist and keep running during that time. And so we'll show you how to do that in the context of your Chef Server as well, where maybe you have a very large migration, or maybe you're migrating between a data center that's far away from your current one. And so we'll show you how to deal with that as well, and to keep your downtime to a minimum. Then finally, at the end, we're going to show you how to get everything restored into your new Chef server, which is the art of unpacking. And we'll show you how to, again, make that smooth and easy as possible so you can enjoy your new Chef server. All right, Josh, why don't you tell us about the tools that we're going to be using today?
Thanks, Irving. Yeah, so like Irving said, we're going to be taking object-based backups of your Chef server data. And to do that, we're going to be using a Knife plugin called Knife EC Backup. And what Knife EC Backup does is it uses the Chef server API to export and import your Chef server objects as JSON files. And that's all of the Chef server objects that you're used to dealing with, like cookbooks, environments, roles, databags, nodes, as well as authentication objects like users, clients, and the ACLs and keys for those users and clients. And then the second plugin that we're going to be using is Knife Tidy, which is kind of a companion plugin to Knife EC Backup, and it does two things. The first functionality that it does is it generates reports and it cleans unused cookbook versions and stale node data. And to do that, we leverage the Chef Search API to pull all of the cookbook versions that you have on your Chef server, as well as all the node objects in each organization, which will list the cookbook versions they use and also their OHI check-in times, so we can find old nodes and unused cookbooks. And then the other functionality that it does is it repairs common validation issues in your EC backup that might exist from older versions of the Chef server that allowed you to import cookbooks with maybe some improper metadata or things like that newer versions of the Chef server will reject. So using Knife Tidy, we can both clean up your Chef server before the backup, and then after you've run your backup, validate and repair any issues that'll prevent it from successfully importing into your new Chef server.
Nice, awesome. Thanks, Josh. All right, so let's dive into the demo. And before we do, I want to share with you a little bit of a personal story. This is an actual picture of a dumpster that I filled a couple of years ago when I moved myself and my family to a new house. And the moral of the story is that any space that you exist in for a while, you're going to collect junk. And it's just an inevitable thing. And you want to clean that up as often as possible to make sure that you're not accruing these things that are just creating a mess in your life. And I, even though we're pretty responsible folks that recycle and gave a lot of things to Goodwill and charity, we still collected things that just didn't fit in the normal process of cleaning up. It was just amazing how much stuff there was. And so when we cleaned that up, that was the actual output of that. And now we're going to show you what that looks like on your Chef server.
Sure. And as I'm screen sharing here to demo this, I see that we have our first question in the Q&A, which is, does this webinar apply if we're moving to OpsWorks? And the answer to that would be yes, because you would still have Knife access to your OpsWorks instance. So you would be able to import all of this EC backup data into OpsWorks.
All right. And we'll have some Q&A time at the end, so don't worry. We'll get to a lot more of your questions.
Great. All right. Are you seeing my screen, everyone? Well,
I see it.
Okay, great. Since you're the only one that can respond, I'll take that. So what we have here is an example Chef server that I made for this demo, and I've loaded it with some realistic Chef server data. And we're going to start off by installing Knife Tidy, which is just a gem that we would install. But one thing that you may have noticed here is I'm installing the gems into a Chef DK that I've installed on my Chef server. And the reason for that is because you want to avoid installing gems into the Chef server gem set that comes packaged with the Chef server install. You want to avoid it as much as possible because there are edge cases with things like restrictive UMasks or other things that have been problematic in the past. So as a rule of thumb, I just recommend not touching your gem set for your Chef server and installing a Chef DK that you can install these tools into. And so I'm just going to gem install this. and it installed it into the embedded gem set for the Chef DK. So we're going to start off, and I'm going to run a server report to generate the report data to see what kind of junk we have in our Chef server. And off the bat here, you can see I have a couple arguments that I'm passing in. There's a node threshold parameter that's used to find stale nodes. It defaults to 30 days. And so for this demo, I'm just going to specify 90 days. And then the -C option is passing in a config file, which I'm using the pivotal.rb, which authenticates as a pivotal user. So running that, it's asking me if I want to blow away my previous reports directory. And you can see here, it pretty quickly generated the reports for my 4 orgs that I have in the Chef server. So if we look at the reports directory, you can see that we have 3 different reports for each of my orgs. There's a cookbook count JSON file that summarizes your cookbook versions by unique cookbook, the count of those. There's a stale nodes JSON that will give you the list of all of the nodes that haven't checked in within the node threshold that you specified in the report command. And then third, we have the unused cookbook report that shows you all of the cookbook versions that you're storing on your Chef server that are not being used by any current nodes. So if we look at one of those, just as an example, you can see here are all the cookbooks that I have on my Chef server, have versions that are sitting there doing nothing but taking up space. So if you've ever run a backup on your Chef server, you'll probably know that cookbooks and node objects are 2 of the biggest, I guess, data hogs in your backup. So editing, cleaning those up will be very helpful for your backup.
That's so cool, Josh. How do we figure out which versions of a cookbook are unused?
That is a great question. And I could show you a little bit of inside baseball. So this is the Nginx log for the Chef server. I'm going to generate another one of these reports since they're fast. And I'll show you the requests that are being made on the Chef server. Scroll up to the top here. So at the beginning, we get a list of all the organizations. And then for each organization, we do a search for all the nodes. And the reason why we do a search is because it lets us get the most data with the fewest number of requests. So as an efficiency measure, we're leveraging the search API to get some of this data. But we're doing what's called a filter result on the search query. So we're not returning back the whole node object. We're only returning the fields we care about, which are the OHI time for check-in, and then a top-level cookbooks attribute, which has the list of all the cookbook versions that are used for that to converge that Chef client. And so you'll see here, so we do that search, and then we also we do an API call to grab all the nodes, not from the search index, and that's just to verify that the search index is up to date. Because since we're relying on the search index to generate these reports, it's very important that they're up to date. So if for some reason your search index was out of date, running this command, it would warn you that your search index is out of date and it would abort. So luckily we don't have that problem, and it continued. A couple other API requests that it makes quickly, it calls all the environments within your organization because those also have cookbook pins that are factored into the report that we generate.
Hey, Josh, is there that cookbooks, top-level cookbooks attribute that you mentioned, is there a version of Chef Client that was introduced in?
Yes. So it was introduced in Chef Client 12.3, which has been out for, I want to say that came out in 2015. So if you have an older Chef client than that, it would probably be worth updating that. Definitely before you generate these reports.
Great point.
Yeah. And actually, when you generate these reports, it will tell you that it doesn't have that cookbook data, and it will tell you that these reports are not valid. So now that I've showed you how to generate those reports, let me show you what you would do with them. There's another command for Knife Tidy called server clean. And what this does is it takes the reports that you generated and it will do API calls to delete all that data. But since I'm just demoing this for right now, I'm going to do a dry run and show you what that would look like. So what this is saying right here is before you run server clean, we want to politely suggest to you that you have a backup of your Chef server data, just in case you delete something that you want back. But another thing I'll say to that is that before you run server clean, you should always audit those reports and make sure that the data in them is correct for your organizations.
I love the level of paranoia we have built into these tools.
Absolutely. Trust but verify. So let me point to a backup directory there. It's giving me some information about the actions it's going to take on what orgs, and I'm going to say yes to continue. And since this is a dry run, it told me what it would have done, but you could see it's making delete calls for all the nodes and the clients that are in the stale nodes report, as well as deleting all the cookbook versions that are in the unused cookbooks list. So using Knife Tidy Server Report and Knife Tidy Server Clean, you can audit all of the junk data on your server and get rid of it before you do your migration. And in practice, I've seen this save significant amount of time. 50–60% of some migrations have been reduced using these commands.
Nice.
All right, and so now that I've showed you how to clean the data, let me show you what it looks like to back it up. So this is a Knife EC backup command. I'm going to kick it off while I'm talking, and then I'll circle back once the results finish. So Knife EC backup is just like Knife Tidy, that it's a gem that you can install. One difference that it does have is because it relies on the PG or PostgreSQL gem. It requires a native C extension to be built, which does have some build dependencies. So if anyone's ever tried to install Knife EC Backup themselves, you might have run into this. Luckily, we have a few resources that can help you with that. If you look at the Knife EC Backup README, there are some directions around building it with those dependencies, as well as the Chef server migration blog post that we wrote several months ago. It has some detailed directions on handling those dependencies. And quickly, I copied part of that blog post just to show you what that dependency set looks like. Since we're on CentOS 7 here, these are the dependencies I had to install: GCC and PostgreSQL Devel. But I already installed those, so I'm going to skip that. But for anyone that's following along at home, the last slide of this deck has some resources that will link you to the blog post and the Knife EC Backup README if you need help with that. So if you have those dependencies installed, it's pretty straightforward to install that gem. So now that I've showed you how to install, while this is still finishing, I want to walk you through what this backup directory looks like. So at the top level of our Knife EC backup directory, we have users and their ACLs, as well as an organizations directory that contains the meat of most of our data here. I'm going to jump into one of my orgs here. And this should look pretty familiar to a lot of people. Has all of your Chef server objects you're familiar with, as well as the ACLs, as well as a few things like some org metadata, invitations for pending members into an org, some things like that.
And this is great because it lets you inspect all of that data as normal JSON files, and you can just crack those files open and see what's going on in them.
Absolutely. It's really good for some introspection into your data to see what's really going on. You can manually prune this before you restore it. I know a lot of people have variations of restore processes, and some people, for example, they might have a Jenkins pipeline that uploads all of their cookbooks from Git repos to a chef server when they build a chef server. So if that was the case for you, you might not want to store this cookbooks directory in your EC backups because you have other ways to rehydrate that. And that's a large part of the data set for this backup. So there's a lot of flexibility with these EC backups on what you can do with the data and what you want to restore. And one other thing I'll say, now that this is finished, so this, you see this took about 2 minutes and 46 seconds. One of the best features of EC Backup is the ability to do what's called an incremental backup. And if you see the command that I ran here, you'll notice that it has this purge flag on it. And if you can read more about that on the Knife EC Backup README if you're curious. But basically what that does is, with an incremental backup, you originally take your full backup. You don't have a copy of your backup to begin with. And once you have that, and you have that directory that I looked into, you can run another incremental backup on top of that, let's say a week later. And that incremental backup will run much quicker because there's some logic in the tool to skip files, specifically cookbook files that it already has. So you could see that this took about 2 minutes and 46 seconds. I do have the output of a full backup here. And if you jump down to the bottom, you can see it took about 11 minutes and 35 seconds. So what we've done with this process is we've made a recommendation that we say, if you're migrating your chef server data, the downtime that you incur should be the sum of the incremental backup, transferring that backup to your destination, and then an incremental restore. And then the bulk of the time you actually of your backup and restore, you can do without downtime. You can take your full backup while your chef server is running, and then once you schedule your downtime and you stop your chef server, you can take an incremental backup that will take fractions of that time. So now that I've showed you a little bit on how to generate this backup, let's talk about how we would use Knife Tidy to validate that it's ready to be restored into a new chef server. So I'm going to run a Knife Tidy command here. So this is Knife Tidy Backup Clean is the command that I'm going to run. I'm specifying my backup path. And if you notice, I'm using a backup called Dirty Data, which is a copy of the backup that I just took, but it's smaller, and I broke some of the objects that are in there to show you some of the things that EC Backup can do. And then at the end, there's just an egrep to highlight the lines that actually output fixes. Oh, you know. There we go. Sorry, I was in the wrong directory. All right. Knife Tidy, Backup Clean, Backup Path Dirty Data. Let's see what we have here. So you can see that ran pretty quickly because for demonstrative purposes that this is just a subset of the backup. But you can see that it found an invalid organization object and it repaired that. It found some corrupt invitations for one of my organizations. It repaired some ACLs on one of my users. And then it corrected some cookbook metadata. Right here, there was a cookbook metadata file that was missing the name. And then there was another one that didn't have any metadata at all that the Tidy tool generated. All right, so now that I've showed you how to clean up that data, let's talk about, oh, you know what? There's one other thing I want to show you about this backup clean. So there is a way that we extend, so Knife Tidy by default will fix no common validation issues that we've ran into with customers, but it won't be inclusive of all the things that you're likely to run into in your data set that might be unique to your business or organization. So we extended the built-in functionality for you to write your own replacement pairs. So there's, if you look at knife, tidy, backup, clean, help, there are two commands here, gen gsub, that will generate a boilerplate substitutions file, and then there's gsub file that you would pass the path to that generated file. So let's make one of those real fast. Knife, tidy, backup, clean. So if we take a look at this file here, so this is using regex to find certain patterns in your cookbooks, and will substitute a replacement string that you specify. Now, this isn't something that everybody needs to use, but it's nice to have if knife tidy doesn't fix all your validation issues out of the box, and you have specific issues that occur over a large set of files that you need to clean up. And if you want to know more about this, you can look at the knife tidy README for more information. And that link is also in the resources slide at the end. So now that I showed you how to back up your data, and I've showed you how to validate and tidy it with server clean, or excuse me, with backup clean, I'm going to show you how you can transport that data to your destination server. So for this process, we're recommending rsync because it jives really well with this whole full backup, incremental backup model that we're recommending here. The first time that you take your backup, you're not going to be, your chef server is still going to be running, so that can take basically as long as you need. You can rsync it over to your destination for the first time, and then when you're running your incremental backup, when you run rsync again, it will only need to sync over the difference of that backup, of that updated incremental backup. So I'm going to, this is my destination right here. And so that directory does not already exist right now. So this would be representative of the initial rsync that you would do. And for my chef server with 4 orgs, this only took a handful of seconds. But you can see, let's delete one of these orgs in here. And run this again. And it took about 3 seconds that time to sync a quarter of the data. And there is some variation in there just, to do with network, because these are AWS instances. But for the most part, it does a really good job of only taking the time to sync the data that has changed.
Yeah, if you've ever had to move a large file server, for example, and you wanted to minimize downtime during that move, this is essentially the same process where you can do that first big long move while the server's up and running and data's changing, and it's okay, because then you're going to do quick catch-up syncs periodically until you're ready to cut over. Then you stop accepting all writes into the source for your actual migration, and then do one final rsync. And then you know that you've gotten a very accurate snapshot very quickly of that data set. So that really helps you cut the downtime that you need to do a migration.
Yeah, and one other thing I'll say, this is a benefit to using rsync. This is an uncompressed directory, and so when you're using rsync, you can pass in a command line argument, I believe it's Z out of these 3, that compresses over the wire. So you're still getting the benefit of compressed data when you're transmitting it, but you don't have to take the time to tar it up, to transport it over the wire, and then to untar it, which can be significant time savings in the middle of a downtime when you're in the middle of a migration.
Right.
So now that I've showed you how to back up your data, how to clean that data, and how to transport it to your destination, let's see what it would look like to restore that data. All right, so While I'm talking, I'm going to kick off the restore command, and then I will circle back. And in a similar way to how I did the backup, this is an incremental restore for the purposes of saving time on this demo, but I did capture the output of the full restore to this file right here. So while that incremental restore is running, we can talk about this one. So let me just jump to the bottom real fast. You can see that this took 15 minutes and 20 seconds for the full restore, and we can compare that to the incremental when it finishes. But one important thing that I wanted to show you in here, oh nuts, I just nuked that file. Okay, well, one of the things that I did want to show you was that when you're doing a restore, sometimes when you're uploading cookbook files, you'll see errors that say cookbook failed to upload, retrying 1 of 5. And what I wanted to show you, and unfortunately, since I nuked the full output, I'm not going to be able to show that to you. When you see those retries, that is actually a race condition with multiple threads that are doing a restore. So out of the box, a KnifeEC backup will use a concurrency of 10 threads. There's a concurrency option that you can specify that with more or less. But what we found when you're doing a concurrent restore of cookbooks is that one of the ways that an incremental restore has speed increases is that when it's uploading a cookbook file, it will do a has request to see if that cookbook file already exists on the destination. And if it doesn't, it will then do a put to upload that file. So if you have 2 different threads that are uploading 2 versions of the same cookbook, let's say 1.0.0 and 1.0.1, and there are identical files between them that have never been uploaded, the first time that each of those threads goes to upload that same file, they'll both see that that file isn't there, and then they'll both try to put that file, and the second one will lose. And so the point that I'm getting at is if you're running with a concurrency of higher than 1 on a restore, there are going to be some errors that are safe to ignore about retrying cookbook uploads. And the way that you'll know that they're safe to ignore is they'll only retry once out of 5, and then a few lines later in the output, you'll be able to see where that cookbook at that version was uploaded. Where you'll see problems in the backup that you should pay attention to them is when you start seeing retries that go above 1 of 5, when they start doing 2 of 5, 3 of 5, 4 of 5, and then after 5 of 5, the restore will fail. But normally, if they get that high, there's some capacity problem with your Chef server that's causing a throughput bottleneck. And so at that point, we would look at either increasing the number of database connections on that front end, or even scaling out the number of front ends across your Chef server that we do that restore on.
Yeah, that's a great point. If the Chef server you're restoring to gets overloaded, then you'll start to see a high error rate, because that restore can be quite often much more intensive than even day-to-day operations on that server. And so if that's the case, the other thing you can do is just bump the concurrency down to 1 or 2, and then that gives that server a lot more breathing room if you don't want to scale it up just for a restore.
Yeah, it's basically a mass times velocity exercise at that point. You can move more data faster, or you can move less data slower.
That's a good analogy.
All right, so it looks like my restore finished here. And if you remember before, the full restore took about 15 minutes and some change. This one took 2 minutes and 7 seconds. And if, yeah. So that is how you would successfully restore your data. But after you restore it, you want to make sure that that data is there and it's good. So a couple things that you can do after you restore to sanity check is to run the Chef server test suite, which you can run by Chef server cuddle test. And what this will do is it will basically create organizations that will use all of the API endpoints of your Chef server just to validate that everything's working as expected. And in addition to that, you can also verify cuddle org list. You can see that all your orgs are there, including that pedant one that's in the process of being used for the tests. That should be cleaned up at the end. But you can also then set up a knife file and start inspecting inside some of your orgs, or you can use the pivotal key. Let's see. All right. See if I typed that correctly. I did. Okay. So what I did there is I did a knife node list, and Pivotal by default has access to every org. So I was using the Pivotal conf. But one thing in the Pivotal conf, or the Pivotal RB, is that it does not specify an organization. So I had to pass in my chef server URL pointing to a specific org. But I could do that for, I remember how to spell these. Yeah, so you can verify that all your data is there in the way that you expect. I could even say, look at a specific node. You can verify that all your data is there as you expect it.
That's really cool, Josh. And if you're super paranoid, could you also flip a few canary hosts over to this new Chef server and try it out?
You absolutely could do that. So since KnifeEC Backup backed up your nodes, the clients, and then the client keys, if your Chef client can resolve to your new Chef server, it can converge the same way that it could on the old one. So you can put in a DNS host entry in your Etsy host file to point to your new server and check in and verify that everything works as expected.
Awesome.
All right.
All right. And I think that's the end of the demo. And thanks, everybody. Nice work, Josh. The demo gods were mostly on your side there.
I agree. I'm luckier than I could have hoped for.
Yeah. All right. So before we get to your questions, there's a couple of frequently asked questions that I want to bring up just because we get asked these a lot. And I'd love to talk about those first. So one really quick one. We get asked often, is there going to be a Chef server version 13 or 14 to match the Chef client 13 and 14 releases that are out? And the answer to that is no. The Chef server is staying at version 12 for the foreseeable future, and there's no plans to rev the major version of that. The reason is that the Chef server API has been really, really stable, and we run that same version of Chef server in hosted Chef and in OpsWorks, and it can handle Chef clients, I've heard, as old as 10 without a problem. So that API doesn't move very often, and so we don't need to rev the version often. Second question, and I'll ask you, Josh, to tell me. Let's say that you've got a really large Chef server data set and you're worried that downtime could be really long. Do you have any other tips for us to minimize that downtime?
Absolutely. One thing that I mentioned when I was talking about the restore is that you might want to parallelize your restore across multiple front ends. And the reason that you would want to do that is because even though KnifeEC Backup within an organization, it will do threaded tasks in parallel, it backs up each organization serially. So if you have a large list of organizations, you can chunk those up across multiple front ends and run multiple restores of your data at the same time.
Nice. And yeah, we've seen that really be able to speed up some really big migrations. So I think, Josh, you and I were helping some customers move some pretty huge data sets, and they were able to cut their downtime down to, I think, 1 to 2 hours for some really massive Chef servers. So that was pretty cool.
Some of the biggest Chef servers that are in existence had their migration in a couple hours doing it this way.
Yeah, that's awesome.
And as a rule of thumb, the more front ends you have, you can roughly divide that time by the number of front ends because it really does scale very well.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, one more question for you, Josh. I saw when you were doing that demo that you had some flags that you didn't explain. They were -- with SQL host and with SQL user. Can you tell me what those are about?
Yeah, so I think the two flags you're referring to are with user SQL and with key SQL.
Thank you.
Yeah, and what those two flags are, so I mentioned before that Knife EC Backup uses the Chef Server API to import and export all of these objects. There are a couple limitations currently in the API implementation of EC Backup. So the users object, for example, does not return all of the fields for the user object that are in the database. There's a couple fields like password hash, external authentication UID, which is used for linking LDAP records, that are not returned in the API. So if you use Chef Manage, for example, all of your users that you had would have to reset their passwords if you aren't using LDAP, or if they are using LDAP, they would have to go through the step of manually linking their accounts when they log in for the first time. So to get around that, because that can be kind of a hassle for people that want to use Manage, these SQL flags with user SQL will, instead of using the user API endpoint, it will do a SQL query to pull the records directly from the database and then import those directly into the database on a restore. And similarly, with key SQL, it works around a limitation for clients in the API. So most people that are using a Chef server, they only have one key for their clients because that's the default behavior. But there are API endpoints that will allow you to attach additional client keys to a client object. So for example, if you had a pre-existing private key that you wanted to attach to a client that was a CI/CD agent, you would generate that client, and then you would run the client add key endpoint and add a second key to that. And unfortunately, when you call that client object with the API, it'll only return the first key. So if this is your use case that you use multiple client keys per client, you would have to use the with key SQL flag to grab all of the client keys.
Nice. That's good to know. And yeah. I also heard that we are going to be fixing that in the near future. So in the coming months, you won't need to worry about those flags at all.
That is very true. There's an open, there's a pull request that myself and one of my coworkers were working on. We weren't able to get it finished by the time of this webinar, but hopefully in the near future, that's something you can keep your eye out for. And then you can just act like those SQL flags never existed.
Awesome. All right, we've got a ton of audience questions, so let's get through as many of these as possible until Jamie makes us stop answering questions. So the first one, and I put some of the really, really good ones up front because I love these questions. The first one is, can we exclude certain cookbooks and probably nodes or any other objects where they're being replicated on many Chef servers? And the answer is yeah, there are other steps that you could layer into this process. So eventually what you're going to have this cycle of export, tidy, rsync, import, and you're going to want to turn that into a script that runs very repeatably and without any kind of opportunity for human error. And you could build into that script additional steps that maybe you need to customize for your environment. Like in the process, trim out all of the nodes named foo because those were test nodes that somebody made one day. And you can do that, or you can clean them up before you do the export. So you have the choice to do either one. Next question. What are the And I really like this one, and we talk about this in the blog post, but what are the common reasons to use Knife EC Backup and Knife Tidy? And one of the most common use cases for using Knife EC Backup is if you want to either go from a Chef server of one topology to another, for example, from a standalone to an HA cluster, or from a standalone to an OpsWorks server, or if you want to move data centers. Let's say you're in the process of moving and lifting and shifting all your applications from your internal data center where everything's on like RHEL 5 over to brand new shiny instances in AWS that might be running RHEL 7 or Ubuntu. This lets you not have to worry about any of that at all, and not even have to worry about upgrading that old server, which can introduce risk in the process. So part of why we did this that was really important for our customers is to not make them go through a painful upgrade before having to migrate.
Yeah, that's a great point. Previous to Knife Tidy really existing, if you wanted to move from one version of the Chef server to another, there weren't really strong guarantees that there weren't schema changes or other things that had changed between those two versions. So oftentimes you would have to back up all your data, clone that server, you would clone your source server, and then do the backup operations on there. You would have to upgrade that server in place, move all your data over. It created an extra headache. So one of our inspirations to Knife Tidy was to simplify that process where you didn't have to do an interim upgrade, and that Knife Tidy would fix some of those validation issues for you.
Yeah, it's so sweet how it does that. All right,
sorry, go ahead.
I was going to move on to another question. Did you have anything more you wanted to say, Josh?
I was just going to say, being the person that had to walk through every Chef server schema migration upgrade and make sure that we factored everything into Knife Tidy, it does a pretty good job of skipping versions.
Thank you for going on that journey so that we all don't have to. All right, here's another good question. Larry asks, are there Knife Tidy and Knife EC Backup, those Ruby gems we mentioned, are they required to be run on the Chef server itself, or could they be run on a Chef server workstation? What do you think, Josh?
So in a perfect world, they would not have to be run on the Chef server. Unfortunately today, because of if you need those SQL flags with user SQL and with key SQL, the Postgres port is not externally accessible on your Chef server. So if you need to use those SQL commands, you do need to run them today on your Chef server. That's something that should go away as we merge the pull requests to get rid of those SQL options. If that's still a deal breaker for you today, there are some creative solutions. You could do port forwarding through SSH or something like that to externalize that port to the workstation that would need to run those commands.
Yeah, I've done that trick before. All right. Next question. Stephen asks, will these tools work for moving a single org? Absolutely, they will. So Knife EC Backup has a flag -- only org. So you can specify a single org or even a small number of orgs to answer instead of having to move everything.
And that's true for Knife Tidy as well.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. Next question. Curious if they will also apply to combining multiple Chef servers into one.
Oh, this is a great question.
It is a good question. And this is where things get a little bit tricky because you can totally use this to combine multiple Chef servers into one. But this is where you've got to be really careful about not overwriting global objects. And Josh, can you remind us what those global objects are?
Sure. Those are users, user ACLs, organizations, and then there are some global containers for users and for organizations.
Yeah, so if you want to do this, I would say it would be best to probably get somebody who's really familiar with this process to help you. What you'd end up doing is probably writing out from multiple Chef servers, combining that into a common directory structure and making sure that you're not introducing conflicts in that process, and then restoring from that one directory structure. So it can get a little bit tricky, but and I'd say it's kind of an advanced level thing to do, but it is doable.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, today the biggest limitation to combining multiple backups into restoring to a single destination is those SQL commands. Because they're doing direct SQL queries and they're pulling SQL records with primary keys in them. And so when they restore them with specific primary keys in the database, as opposed to the API method that just inserts an object that gets the next auto-incremented primary key. This is something that we hope that's going to go away soon once we can merge in the functionality that makes those commands redundant. But for now, if you wanted to take two different chef servers and combine them into one, what I would do is I would not use those SQL options. I would follow Irving's advice. And basically what that was is that you want to make sure that between your two chef servers, if there's conflicting data, the last one that runs is going to win. So if I have a user JHUD on two different chef servers and they have two different emails, for example, when I back up my first one and I back up my second one, the second one, the record is going to win. If I'm backing them up into the same backup directory.
Yeah, that's where those conflicts can get you. One bit of trivia: the EC in Knife EC Backup stands for Enterprise Chef, and the reason why that's there is to differentiate from some other Knife plugins that existed. Knife EC Backup is the only plugin that's aware of all of those global Enterprise Chef options, like the global containers and organizations. There are other tools that you can use, like Knife Download, and those work within the context of a single org. So that's another way that you could ship data around without having to worry about those global objects.
And one final thought before we move on, DJ or anyone else that's interested in the topic of migrating multiple chef servers to a single one, feel free to reach out to me. I'm Jay Hudson in the Chef Community Slack, and we can talk about this offline.
Cool. Awesome. Let's see. I think we got time for another question or two. So Brian asks, the docs in GitHub show that Knife EC Backup is installed in Chef Server 12 by default, but it's not showing when I try and run it from my Chef server. So that is true. That's something that we added not in earlier versions of Chef Server 12, but I think over the past year and a half, we've started picking up the latest Knife EC Backup gem and installing it in Chef Server. So if you're not seeing it in your Chef Server's gem list, then that might be a reason why, is that you just got to update. But now whenever we cut a Chef Server release, we always pick up the latest version of that gem and ship it in there. Another question, Obina asks, how do we get the nodes to connect to the new Chef server? So let's say, I think that's that Canary node example we were talking about earlier, Josh.
Sure. So in the Canary sense, when you're not switching everything over, but after you've done your restore to your destination, you want to verify it, you can either go into a node that's registered to your old Chef server, and you can edit the Chef server URL and its client.rb to point to your new Chef server, or you could just edit the Etsy host file on that client and change the DNS resolution of that host name to resolve to your new Chef server.
Awesome. Yeah, that's how I do it.
But in the context of the actual live production switchover, more often than not, what we see is that people will flip the DNS from the old Chef server to the new one, and then all the clients that are pointing to that DNS entry will just, assuming that they don't have a client-side DNS cache, they'll converge to the new Chef server as soon as they can resolve the DNS to that one.
Awesome. Fantastic. And I'm just doing a quick scan to see if there's maybe one more question we can squeeze in here. Josh, did you see any of your favorites that we didn't get to?
There's so many. I haven't made it that far down the list. And I will say I love all of these questions, and I really want to answer all of them. Unfortunately, we're a little limited on time for the webinar, but as you'll see in the references slide at the end of this deck, we do have a channel for Chef server migrations in the community Slack that we would love for you to bring these questions there. You can ping myself, Jay Hudson, or Irving at Irving directly, or you could just ask an open-ended question in the channel, and we'll make sure that you get some feedback.
Yeah, let's go ahead and go to our resources slide and give you those pointers. So in our resources here, we have a couple links that will be really useful. One is a blog post that Josh and I wrote last October that was the inspiration for this webinar, where we go through some examples and also give you some more details. And that's on the Chef blog. And within that, we link to the two Ruby gems that we mentioned, Knife EC Backup and Knife Tidy. Those are on GitHub and they're open source. So you can hit those links anytime. They come with pretty decent READMEs. that explain how they work. And so you should be able to look at those and get those installed and play around with them as well. And if you have any questions, definitely let's talk in the Chef Server Migration channel in the community Slack. And then one last link, and this was kind of a cool one that I'm glad we got to share, was the parallelized restore script that our coworker Jeremy wrote for one of those big migrations. And that was a Ruby script that we made that took the process of chunking up the orgs and splitting them up into a set of phases that could be put onto different front ends and made that a possibility. So I thought that was a really cool thing to share.
And another really cool thing about the script that Jeremy made is it actually looks at the number of objects in each of the organizations and sorts them by that so that it can figure out the most, it can make the chunks as equal as possible.
Yeah, that was a really important thing, because if you just sort them alphabetically, you might find that one front end takes a lot longer than the rest, for example, because it got that one monster org. So this made that even and cut downtime even further.
And I remember there is one question that we didn't get to about getting access to the gem source themselves for building these gems. You can go to either of those repos and you can compile the gems from source.
That's right. I think it's gem build from within a source directory, and it'll create that gem for you.
Yeah, I know that Knife EC Backup has better gem build instructions in the README than Knife Tidy does. So maybe that would be a nice pull request to improve that README.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, everybody, for joining us. And Jamie, let's turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Irving and Josh, for the great information. Again, for those of you that submitted questions that we didn't have time to answer, we'll follow up with you via email or in Slack and address those in the next week or so on the Chef blog, where we'll recap everything we covered here today. And one last thing I want to share with our audience is that ChefConf 2018 is coming up this May. And we invite you to join us in Chicago the 22nd to 25th to continue the conversation with chef experts and community members. Both Irving and Josh will be there, so you can meet them in person. And Josh will be TAing the Chef Automate workshop on Tuesday the 22nd, which is filling up fast, so make sure you check that out when you get registered. As a reminder, a copy of today's slide deck and additional help materials are available in the resource list widget at the bottom of your screen. And we, of course, hope you found value in the information that Josh and Irving presented today. If you like what you saw, we encourage you to share the recorded presentation with your teammates or professional networks. The on-demand version should be available by tomorrow, and we'll email you as soon as it's ready, along with a discount code to register for ChefConf. Thanks again for your time, and have a wonderful day.